20553432. It's Caleb Burra presenting Terra Nullius and the dispossession. So we're going to look at the term Terra Nullius and how it was applied to First Nations people. First, I would just like to do an acknowledgement of country. I would like to acknowledge the Whadjuk Noongar people, who are the traditional custodians of the land on which we stand today in Western Australia. I would like to pay my respect to their bright, unique and endless culture, as well as the wide leadership of the elders past, present and future. This country, Budja, where I stand and get to present to you, has belonged to the Whadjuk Noongar people for thousands of years, facilitating the gatherings of the community. For they hold the memories, culture and traditions of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander across Australia. Now also, just a warning, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people viewing this presentation are advised that it may contain information, images and stories of people who have passed away. Information and topic discussed can be and may be upsetting and uncomfortable to view and listen to. Correct proceedings have been taken care to ensure cultural respect. If there is material that is inappropriate and concerning, please contact the details provided below, which was just the student number at student.curtin.edu.au. Without further ado, let's get started. Well, an introduction. Major political and religious conflicts within Europe forced groups to set sail beyond to explore, conquer, and claim new land. The arrival of the first settlers in 1788 saw the birth of a lengthened civil and political war, which was a display of manipulated ethics and a scarcity of morals in claiming the indigenous in what was deemed as terra nullius by the European settlers. In this presentation, we are critically analysing the British framework known as Terra Nullius, meaning no man's land, and looking how it was applied to Indigenous people of Australia upon the arrival of the first Europeans in 1788. We will look at the vast effects of this framework upon Indigenous people, including the dispossession of land, culture, and tradition. Embedded in this, we will discover other colonial approaches to land and Indigenous people, including conquest, a few other things like that. But here we go. So a little backdrop, the Age of Expansion, to just orientate ourselves. The Age of Expansion, also known as the Age of Exploration, refers to an early part of the modern period between the 15th and 17th centuries. Sailors and seafarers from a number of countries across Europe explored, colonized and conquered regions across the globe for a vast number of reasons, but mainly in lieu of major religious and political conflicts in Western Europe, the desire for an increase of resources such as silver and gold, and lastly, the inhibition of a land to British convicts. William Janzoon, the first document discovery and landing of Australia was in 1606 by the Dutch explorer William Janzoon. However, the first settlement in Sydney, led by Governor Arthur Phillip, consisted of approximately 800 convicts and their European marine officers. They arrived in the first fleet of 9 transport ships, 2 small warships at Botany Bay in January 1788. So, what actually is Terra Nullius, and how was it applied to Indigenous people? The term Terra Nullius is Latin for nobody's land. Since 1788, when the first Europeans arrived in this country we just talked about, Indigenous people have been stripped of their land, culture, a right or position to have a voice. This was done through the framework of Terra Nullius. Terra Nullius is a legal doctrine the British settlers applied upon their arrival to Australia to justify their right to occupy and claim the land as theirs. Furthermore, in accordance with this doctrine, if land was deemed unowned, without inhabitants, by a civil society according to European standards. Now, this is a key understanding. European standards. European powers could claim ownership and sovereignty over the land, disregarding the Indigenous people who already were occupying the land. The British motives for imposing Terra Nullius included the economic exploitation of resources, cultural and racial supremacy, conquest, and the colonization for the placement of exiled convicts. Under the international common law at the time, it is argued that the British were on It was argued that they were on uncertain legal footing when attempting to claim Terra Nullius for Australian land within the framework of their own laws. International law states that in order to establish a position over territory, it has to be primarily achieved through occupation. This must be followed by the intention to possess the land, excluding others from temporarily or permanently occupying it. However, Europeans declared that the territory they discovered was empty, unoccupied, devoid of civilized societies, which were in accordance with their own definition of civilization and European norms, agricultural practices, denying the indigenous of ownership. It was argued, so these are the points that were argued, that the indigenous people standards didn't meet with the European. The indigenous people ranged the land instead of residing over it, right? Importantly, the acts of enjoyment of the land, which is highlighted in the international law for possession of a land, acts of enjoyment of land through fishing, camping, and hunting, were deemed insufficient as they weren't tilling the land for agricultural practices. Now, agricultural practices is the European normality. So furthermore, along the coastlines of Australia, acts of gathering seaweed, taking shellfish, and planting stakes and fishing nets were conclusive evidence for possession of the shoreline highlighted by the law, but were actually overlooked by the Europeans. A failure to make adjustments and shift perspectives to the societal normalities of the Europeans led to the unrightful declaration of Terra Nullius over Australia from the indigenous people. These pieces of evidence presented of land occupations by the indigenous highlighted, because they weren't in line with the standard European norms, were outweighed, they were overlooked, because they didn't fit the framework of Terra Nullius. This was pivotal in helping use the Terra Nullius Act under common law to gain sovereignty over the lands by the Europeans. This was overruled in 1992 under the Mabo ruling, but for that length of period of time, the 17th century, up until then, it wasn't. It was declared for the British through Terra Nullius. So what are the adverse effects of this? Well, dispossession. Despite the recent revoking of declaring Australia as Terra Nullius, and this is actually an image from a Australia called Joseph Lycett, shows you the indigenous people actually, the acts of enjoyment of the land. You can see some hunting and stuff going on, was by one of the articles and actual essential readings in our unit, and I just thought it would be really good to put in there, and it's been referenced in the appendix. So the adverse effects of Terra Nullius. Well, the adverse effects saw indigenous people meet face to face with dispossessions and its terrible ramifications. The term dispossession refers to the forcible act of taking something away from oneself, commonly referring to the act of having property, especially land or territory, taken away from a person, group of people. In this scenario, it wasn't just the land indigenous people were stripped of, but also their traditions, culture, and community, because they're all very closely intercorrelated. Dispossession involves the forced removal of indigenous people from their ancestral lands. The displacement the indigenous faced post-Terra Nullius disrupted and removed connections with the land that had been established for thousands of years. The connections held spiritual ties to ancestors, cultural knowledge, and economic opportunities for indigenous communities. The stripping away of the physical land saw the depletion of resources and a livelihood for indigenous peoples. Indigenous peoples in this time period were known for the vast skills and knowledge living off the land. The dispossession of the land saw indigenous people suffer with little to no access to natural resources, including water and native wildlife, for hunting, as dispossessed natural land was urbanized and exploited for resources and residency. This perpetuated cycles of economic inequality, poverty, and colonial dependency within indigenous communities in order to survive. Dispossession forced indigenous communities to assimilate and integrate into a new lifestyle, including culture, language, and traditional practices. This time period, the British colonists enforced their ideology and belief system into indigenous communities, talking about the cultural, the racial supremacy. They simultaneously erased and created strict laws that prohibited the continuation of these traditions and practices the indigenous people possessed, as well as the rich history of indigenous people, which has just negatively impacted the psychological well-being among indigenous peoples, creating turmoil and conflict among people groups in the present day, contributing to feelings of alienation and trauma. And so in conclusion, when the British arrived upon Australia, the Terra Nullius framework in which they used to take the land was not a viable reason for action. The harsh overlooking of a difference in standard due to cultural norms meant that the indigenous people lost their land unjustly. We have looked at the serious effects of Terra Nullius and dispossession, which included degradation and depletion to a rich culture of indigenous people. We saw the unfair fall of people who for all of time have been the rightful owners of the nation we stand on in all aspects of life, including economic downfall and erosion of their cultures, families, tradition, language, and land. And yeah, thank you for listening. Reference list, appendix for the picture. And I'm just going to quickly stop by. Please pause to view each slide.